Afternoon. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt. I appreciate everyone coming out this afternoon. Today we're going to have about a 45-minute discussion and then a Q&A session done by the index cards that were submitted earlier. After the event, our friends from Urban Reads bookstores are here to sell the book. Please purchase a copy and get it signed afterwards. Again, I want to let everyone know, if you haven't been here before or it's been a while since you have, we have a new initiative here at the Pratt. We provide free parking for all our author programs. It's at the Franklin Street Garage. You come in, you park at the Franklin Street, you tell me, I give you a voucher, you're good to go. And finally, this is one of many programs we have this winter for our Writers Live program. Kwame Alexander and Dara Coulter are coming on Tuesday. They're going to be talking about their book, An American Story. It's a picture book that looks at slavery in America. Everyone who attends that program will receive a free copy of the book. And also Kadeta Williams, the historian, is coming on January 19th. That's this Thursday. Her new book is called I Saw Death Coming. It's about Reconstruction. Hope you can attend one of those programs or another Pratt program in the future. This afternoon, I'm happy to welcome Ben Jealous to the Pratt Library to discuss his new book, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. In it, he reflects on race in America and offers his thoughts on how to address the country's social and political issues. Ben Jealous is a professor of the practice at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a former national president and CEO of the NAACP and was the 2018 Democratic nominee for governor of Maryland. This afternoon, he is joined in conversation by C4, Clarence Mitchell IV, a talk show host on WBAL News Radio 1090 AM and 101.5 FM. He is also a former Maryland state senator. Author and journalist April Ryan called Never Forget Our People Are Always Free a must-read manifesto of what's possible when we center love, faith, and aspiration in our common cause. An award-winning historian, Henry Louis Gates Jr., noted, Ben Jealous appeals to our better angels through storytelling that is righteously funny, deeply moving, and profoundly insightful. He is utterly brilliant, and his work to bridge our differences has never been more important. It's my great pleasure to welcome Ben Jealous and C4 to the Pratt.
Can we just sit down? I don't want to stand at a podium. I'm just going to sit down and have this conversation. First of all, thank you so much for coming out this evening. The fight for freedom needs freedom fighters. The public service is the rent you pay for your existence on this earth. Those were the credos that were burned into the DNA of 4 generations of my family, beginning with the late Dr. Lily Mae Jackson, and what she took into 3 other generations, including one sitting here in front of me, my uncle, State Senator Michael Mitchell, who is here in the audience tonight, as well as my sister, Lisa Mitchell Sinar. And so that type of burning into the DNA of Juanita Jackson Mitchell, Clarence Mitchell Jr., Perrin Mitchell, Clarence Mitchell III, and down into Lisa, myself, and our children, that's the same energy that came from maybe Todd Bland and the generations before her that burned that same credo, that same spirit into generations, leading to Benjamin Todd Jealous, who joins us tonight. And so I hope that we can, over the next hour, talk about the type of vision that Ben has had in many moments of his life, from what he's doing now with the Sierra Club as a leader of that, to People for the American Way, to his leadership at the national NAACP, to his work at the Jackson Advocate down in Mississippi, when he was there not long after that wonderful newspaper had been firebombed, and the gentleman that mentored him, Mr. Tisdale, who was a mentor of his for many years, helped to also burn into him the desire to do things like this book. Never forget, our people were always free, a parable of American healing. And I want to start that way because as we talk about the different aspects that Ben looks at in this book, it will help inform you of why that work needs to continue. So with that introduction, Benjamin Todd Jealous, thank you so much once again.
Thank you. Thank you, C4. Good to see you, Mike. Good to see you, Lisa. You know, this First of all, I want to thank the Enoch Pratt Free Library. It's such an honor to be here. I see my cousins. If you guys ever need to buy flowers, Baltimore Blossom Studio
Yes.
in Ashburton, my cousin Rachel Bland and her beautiful daughter Jordan are here.
We just got some, by the way, some flowers not long ago, Ben Jones.
And thank you. Good. Yeah, I mean, they're great, aren't they?
They're fantastic.
You know, yes, you know, really the best flowers in Baltimore. My son Jack is here.
Jack.
And
welcome.
I see a lot of other friends in the audience. This library was a special place for my mom. My mom was such a precocious reader growing up in McCullough Homes that Hopkins sent researchers over to study her when she was like 3 years old, because they didn't understand how a Negro child who was 3 could be reading at multiple grade levels ahead. But that was my mom, and she loved this place. My grandmother really got her start in Baltimore watching Mike, to be honest. She was Juanita's babysitter when Juanita Mitchell, Clarence's grandma, would run the branch meetings. She was also, Kate showed up here, a college graduate, a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and on her own path. She'd go to work for Planned Parenthood. She would mentor, if you want to see Senator Mikulski cry, mention my grandma. She mentored Barbara Mikulski as a social worker. She came back from social work school. You know, Thurgood Marshall, just to set it up a little bit, Thurgood Marshall had sued the graduate schools in Maryland, the public graduate schools in the 30s. It was the only real precursor to Brown versus Board. Maryland had no law against educating blacks in its graduate schools, but its practice was to exclude all of them. And so the decision was that Maryland would pay for black graduate students to go out of state.
As my grandmother did. Juanita Mitchell went to the University of Pennsylvania at the age of 14 and graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at 18 on Maryland, paying her tuition to go to an Ivy League school as opposed to go here. That's how deep racism was in those days.
And I teach at the University of Pennsylvania today because my grandmother graduated from there in 1953, paid for by the state of Maryland, who I think was pretty much trying to export Juanita and export Mamie and hope that the likes of them would never come back. But she came right back, and she started a war with the gentlemen's clubs in Baltimore that were sexually exploiting 12-year-old girls, 13-year-old girls. And that's how Child Protective Services in the city was started, was to make sure that people could not sexually exploit tweens and teens for profit. My grandma, though, carried many riddles with her, and that's really what inspired this book. She would say, never forget our people were always free. And I want to talk to you about that just for a second. I'm going to read page 24 and 25 of the book, just a bit of it. As a child, I soaked up my grandmother's stories like cornbread soaks up butter mixed with maple syrup. My grandmother, like every woman we knew before her in her bloodline, was the family griot. She was the one who told stories over and over while she cooked, while we ate, while we played cards, while we sat on the beach. She was a veteran statewide leader in the war on poverty and a local soldier in the civil rights movement. Usually she told her tales and those of her parents and grandparents as a form of instruction, like an old general. She didn't expect you to fight in the same ways as she had or they had. Her faith, however, was that if you knew how she fought her battles, then you would find yourself better prepared in a future fight. Sometimes, however, her statements were riddles she hoped you would be inspired to solve, like the one about colonial rebellions. Other times, she made claims that were ridiculous on their face and then confounded you with her insistence they not be contradicted. Never forget our people were always free. She would offer as a diversion from the subject at hand. She often seemed to insert it as an offhand closer to a conversation about some sensitive aspect of our family's history and slavery about which she did not want more discussion. When I was a kid, it made my brain hurt. It just didn't make any sense. Jack, you know what that's like. Parents say stuff don't make sense. When I was a teenager, I decided to challenge her head on. What are you talking about, Mimi? 3 of your 4 grandparents were born into slavery. The 4th was a white man your own sister says was probably a rapist. Who was free? The rapist? She just stared at me like she pitied me. She would never say a curse word, but by the look on her face, I'd say she thought me either an idiot or and there's a word I won't say in the library. Ultimately, I relented. Challenging it seemed as cruel and futile as an atheist trying to convince a devout nun that Mary wasn't a virgin. Historically, the women in many families in the griots in the West African tradition don't just hand down important stories. They hand down traditions, religion, recipes for success, and the peculiar convictions and articles of faith that make a family and a tribe a tribe. This, I reasoned, must just be one of the latter two.
Ben Jealous, if I can step in for a moment here, and
Please.
that is, we're going to talk, everyone, together, share a conversation for about the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so. And then the last 15 minutes, we have some questions that have been written down, that have been submitted, that we will then share with the audience, and Ben will react to the questions that we have. But I don't want you to skip over. We're going to talk about all 21 chapters, 219 pages of your book. But I don't want to skip over that relationship between United States Senator Barbara Mikulski and Mamie Todd Bland, because our family knew Councilwoman Barbara Mikulski, City Councilwoman, Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski, before she went on to be the longest reigning woman member of the United States Senate and others. So we saw the finished product, so to speak. What impact, and she said this, did Barbara Mikulski, your grandmother, have on her?
Well, and I see some activists in this room who were with me on the Don Quixote-like journey. That was my kid. I told Wes the other day, Wes has been my friends. Baltimore's blessed to have 5 black men who have won
to
have 5 black men who have gone to Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship, starting with Kurt Schmoke. And I am 3, and Wes is 4, and Fagan Harris, who will be Wes's chief of staff, is number 5. And when Wes won, I mentored that brother for like 5 minutes because I had just gotten back from Oxford. And, I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, yes. So when I was running for governor, I just told Wes the other day, I said, look, brother, I'm like the Jesse Jackson to your Barack Obama, but I ain't trying to cut nothing off yet. So let's just,
No surgery. No surgery.
And we got a good laugh on that. But there I was. We were up at theater, Northwest Baltimore. It was a women's political event. And Barbara Mikulski walked up to me, and I felt her before I saw her, because I'm looking like up here, right? And her finger was like right here. I looked down, and she says, "You're Mamie Todd's grandson, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And a tear started to roll down her face. And she just kept crying the whole time, telling me what a hero she was in child protection, telling me how she inspired her when she was a young social work student, telling me about her role, not just in setting up every undergraduate bachelor social work program in the entire state of Maryland. That was her last act. She had been the head of implementing the head of social policy because of the Mitchells for the state of Maryland and implementing the war on poverty for the state. The governor had to put her name on the license plate because the cops kept shooing her away from the parking lot because she had colored on her driver's license. And I got Barbara Mikulski and my grandmother together the very end of my grandma's life, about 2 weeks before she passed. I got them on the phone. And what was incredible, first of all, they trashed the men in Annapolis. That was hysterical. That was hysterical. But then, after they caught up on that, was this buoyant optimism, just this incredible optimism. And it reminded me, I challenged my grandmother on that too. I got back from Columbia University and you send people away to the Ivy League and it makes them jaded for a minute. It's kind of the fashion in those places. My grandmother looked at me and she said, baby, how'd you become such a pessimist? She said, it's true. Pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. And as for me, I'll take winning. And I said, what do you mean, Grandma? And she said, life is like a boxing match. Think about Muhammad Ali and the rumble in the jungle. Pessimist gets in that ring and they say, you know what, I'm going to get beaten up, I'm going to get knocked down. And round 1 that happens, and round 2 that happens, round 3 they've been beaten up and knocked down again, and round 4 they throw in the towel because 3 points on a graph is a trend, it's over. She said, but the optimist is like Muhammad Ali. They might get knocked around by George Foreman every single round, but every round they get back in saying, this might be the round I don't get knocked down. And then in the 12th, they say, you know what, just hold it together. All you got to be is the last man standing in this round, and all that getting knocked around don't matter. That's the women who raised us. Juanita trained my grandma. The Mitchells invested her. Her most prized role in all of Maryland was being the secretary for the secret cabal that was Juanita, Perrin, and Clarence Mitchell planning how the legislation that Clarence was helping to design down in Washington with Perrin, but Clarence really even more of an architect, Perrin helping to pass, was going to be implemented in the city that they love so much. From that experience, she would always tell me, if they ever ask you to be the secretary, never turn it down, because you get to control what everybody recalls that they actually
That's
said.
correct. That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. Once again, Vangelis, never forget our people were always free. That's the book. Please get it. And when it comes to the issue of lies, we talk about 3 lies about race in here. Let's just deal with a couple of them. Let's talk about when you write about it has always been this way. What do you mean by that being a lie?
My grandmother would say, never forget, before there were slave rebellions, there were colonial rebellions. My college professor, the first man who taught me political science, Charles V. Hamilton, co-author of Black Power with Stokely Carmichael, said the same thing. And I pushed him on it and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, politics is a lot like physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. We would call that, Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump, like that. And he said, and something in motion, and race relations is always in motion, will return to its original state. The problem with Americans is that we can only remember what we see on a screen. And when it comes to slavery, back then, what we know is roots. Now you might say Django or 12 Years a Slave. And invariably, those portrayals of slavery are of slavery near its end. And well, Mr. Jealous, the end of something is not the original state of anything. What he was talking about was that for 100 years in the Virginia colony, where my family came up, we migrated north, but not to the north. We stopped in Baltimore, where my family came from, where Shal and Jordan's family came from. The definition of race for the first 100 years was what it had been for like half a millennia before that, when the word raza was created in Italian. It meant genus, it meant type. When applied to people, it meant tribe or nation. We Scots are a mighty race. We Irish are a mighty race. And tribes can fight with each other, but they do so on the presupposition that they are all human. And so you, as Barbara Fields pointed out, a historian at Columbia, if you look at the slave rolls in the 1600s, even into the early 1700s, they record collecting people from places. Only in the 1700s are we black folks recorded as chattel, as animals, as Negroes, as subhumans, because the race, the definition has been changed from tribe, as it had been at that point for 600 years, to mean a color caste system that went from the superhuman white Anglo-Saxon to the, through the Irish, through the Indians, to the subhuman Negro, to Caliban, half ape, half man. And that is what I get into in my book, is the sort of the why of it. And the why of it is European indentured servants. This is why there's so many black folks who like have freckles. Freckles only come from one place. Like curly hair only comes from one place. Right? European indentured servants, typically Irish. And African slaves were at the bottom of the economy in the Virginia colony for 100 years, and they kept coming together and rebelling together. And the Virginia colony tried to use the military. It worked, but not completely. They changed laws. It worked, but not completely. And then they reached for the cudgel that is culture. And changing the definition of race worked better than anything before. This is the bamboozling Dr. King talked about, convincing a white man that his greatest possession was his whiteness. And no matter how much he had in common with the situation of black folks in his community, he needed to stay away, no matter what.
Vangelis, one of the most powerful things recently in our lifetimes has been the ever knowing or ever growing genealogy effort to actually trace back how far your family goes, and then what are the origins of your family and where they go. And you talk about in the book a conversation you were having with David Gregory, who was then the host of Meet the Press back in 2013.
Yeah.
He no longer is the host. Let's not go back down that road of why he's not the host. Okay. But anyway, he was talking with you off air, and you were sharing with him.
His problem is he's way funnier off air than he was on air.
I bet he was. I can tell people.
I mean, it's a low bar.
The stuff off air is always better than on air, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
But when it came to your conversation, you were sharing with him the knowledge that you, talking with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, and of course that whole effort that he has of finding your roots is wonderful, and he's discovered this many people, that you shared some DNA with Vice President Dick Cheney. And as you were talking with him, also the conversation came up that—
Well, that was traumatic, because I thought I was a well-dressed man. But then I showed up to George W. Bush's last 4th of July party where I was invited because I was the new head of the NAACP. And Dick Cheney was wearing the same outfit. And then even before Gates, because Gates helped me figure out some other things, like I was cousin to Thomas Jefferson. But no, I just like was drinking a little bourbon and like having fun Googling the founding families of New England and the folks my father descend from. And that's how I with Dick Cheney. And I felt okay because Obama was cousins to Cheney and Bush.
Exactly.
So I was like, at least I ain't got Bush. I just got Cheney. But then I remembered that we dressed the same. And I was like, oh, wow, that might be some powerful genes that we've inherited. Like, I got to up my game.
But also, you mentioned in the book that this is Burley Evers, who we know well. As a matter of fact, my grandfather, Clarence Fitzgerald, spoke at Medgar Evers' funeral. And I felt it was very close with Evers that she discovered that she was related to John McCain through DNA. So my point in raising all that is, and you highlight in the book, is the interconnectedness of us, even with political philosophy, even with disagreements, is an important foundation to work from, to try to achieve.
Well, it's part of our pragmatism. It's part of our pragmatism. Our families come from places where we understood that as dysfunctional as the situation was, as terrible, like beyond words as it was, most folks in the room were related to each other. And what I had to meditate on, because when I figured out we were cousins to Robert E. Lee, I walked away from my keyboard.
I didn't mention that.
I was just like, but it explains why I'm scared of Rachel. But I walked away from my keyboard. She got that gene. I just got the lavender check shirt gene that Cheney got. But I walked away from my keyboard. But then I was thinking about Edward David Bland, my grandmother's grandfather, Rachel's father's grandfather. He walked out of slavery at 17. He knew he was walking out of his uncle's house. Dr. Gates helped me get access to the uncle's will. The uncle knew very clearly that Edward David's dad was his brother because the only slave he mentioned in the will was Edward David's dad, Fred Bland, and he spent a paragraph protecting him and clearly delineating how he would be treated for the rest of his life. I said, Dr. Gates, what does this mean? He said, Ben, well, between the DNA and this and the other documents, this man is dying. He knows that his manservant, his slave, is his 6-year-older brother. They would have been raised in the nursery together. And he wants to limit how bad the rest of his life will be. And that man would walk out of slavery too and become a preacher. But Edward David walks out at like 17, and before he's 35, he has run against and beat one of his white cousins, Bland versus Bland, for the House of Delegates in Virginia. He's become the leader of the Black Republicans in the state. 5 years after the end of Reconstruction, but before the definitive rise of Jim Crow. We don't really talk about this period of American history. It's the late 1870s, it's the early 1880s. He's been fighting the Klan for 5 years. And he sees white working class men bolt the Democratic Party because their leaders are saying that they can't afford the Civil War debt and the public schools. And these white working class men, former Confederate soldiers, leave the Democratic Party in droves to start a new party called the Readjusters. And their demand is simple: readjust the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools. And Edward David Bland approaches former Confederate General William B. Mahone, the leader of the Readjusters, who was on his way to being, even though he was Lee's most prized protege, literally removed from all tellings of the Confederate cause by the Daughters of the Confederacy, because they first considered him to be a class traitor by going to help the soldiers when all the generals wanted to suppress this populist rebellion, the former generals. And then after Edward David Bland got done charming him, they wrote him out for being a race traitor, because Edward David Bland approached him and said, y'all want to save those public schools? Well, we started them. That's a product of our Reconstruction governments. So we're down, let's go. And in the end, you ended up with and let me be clear, Edward David Bland prior to that most likely considered William B. Mahone to be a war criminal because he had massacred an entire Black regiment that surrendered. And yet, when you've been fighting the Klan for 5 years and you would go on to have 6 people assassinated in your re-election bid, war criminal looks like a pretty good guy if he shares your political objectives. And so they formed this army of former Confederate soldiers and formerly enslaved men. It ends up being a majority Black party, although like 40% white, but majority Black party led by a former Confederate general and a freeman. They take over the entire Virginia government, the governorship, both houses, both senators. They save those public schools. They make Virginia State the working man's, at the time working man, now working person's rival to UVA. By massively expanding it, they create Virginia State. Even before Bowie, Coppin, and Morgan, there was Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mason-Dixon. They abolished the public whipping post, which was still being used to torture only Blacks in the public square, and they abolished the poll tax. And when I saw that part, as somebody who recently was arrested 5 times in front of the White House a year ago trying to get Biden to speak out more about voting rights, it blew my mind because I was like, of course. The Civil War ended 37 years before Virginia wove the poll tax into its state constitution. But the populist rebellions were only 17 years before. And when they put the poll tax in place, they didn't just disenfranchise 80% of Blacks. They took away the vote from 50% of whites. Mm-hmm. The whites who were most likely to rebel with the Blacks, the people who had made up the party, the Readjusters, they literally outlawed the party with the state constitution.
Well, Ben, I do want to talk about a lot of the history that's informed you, but before we get to the Q&A part of this, we've got to touch, and I'm going to do that after this, what I'm going to react now. So this is second, just put a pin in that, about your relationship. You also call him your brother, Dave Chappelle, and how this recent relationship, because a lot of people want to know, why is Dave Chappelle supporting Ben Jealous for governor? What is he doing in town supporting Ben Jealous for governor? But in the book, you go into this lifelong relationship between your father, his father, how you grew up together, and to how that's helped also to a point. But before we get to that relationship, which is just intriguing in the book too, is I'm going to skip number 2 and go to number 3. The lies that you say are about race. Racism only hurts Black people and people of color. Now, you touched on it with Virginia, but go into deeper. Why do we really need to focus on that? It just
because you can't understand Dr. King without understanding that. Dr. King was not assassinated in the middle of a desegregation battle. Sure, desegregation pressures existed throughout the country, but he was literally organizing a poor people's campaign. His whole point was that racism is an old wedge from a colonial system that profited literally by dividing people. And everybody who gets divided suffers. There was no way to end poverty in America without uniting people across that race line. That's what he was doing. COINTELPRO talked about prevent the rise of a black messiah. They weren't talking about for black people. They didn't say a messiah for blacks. They said a black messiah. Dr. King was trying to lead everybody to come together to end poverty. So think about that stuff. If we accept the thesis that the cost of racism is division that maintains a system of keeping a very large percent of our country very poor, so a very small number, like number, not percentage, number of people can be very, very rich, then every poor person is hurt by racism. There are 8 million and change blacks in poverty. You wouldn't know it from reading the paper, but there are 16 million and change whites in poverty. And we need to understand the game that's being played so we can end it. Dr. King was assassinated trying to explain to us what the game was and how we end it.
You know, Ben Jealous, Richard Pryor, and I only know this because I've got to know his daughter, Rain Pryor.
Yeah,
who's lived in Baltimore
she's wonderful.
for a long time, and
Her mom is an astronomer.
I did not know that.
And I said, astrologist? He said, astronomer.
Okay.
I said, who convinced you to be an astronomer? Get this. Mario Van Peebles Sr.
Wow.
Before he made Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, was an astronomer building satellites in France in the 1950s. And I was just like, that's the wildest story I've ever heard. But things you don't know about Richard Pryor's ex-wives, you know?
No, exactly. It's 6 of them. So it's a few of them.
Yeah,
It's
but
a
she's
few
kind
of
of the dominant one.
But Rain told me off air, and her father actually said it publicly before he died. Richard Pryor said the comedian that most resembled his ability to talk about race in a way that made America look at itself, that made America laugh, that made America do things was Dave Chappelle.
Yeah.
That Dave Chappelle was who he saw in this next round. Talk about Dave Chappelle and you, and kind of that being kind of what you've been around as well. He's funny, but he's also intelligent.
He's intelligent and he preaches. And I think the thing that people, color is a trip in the black community too, right? People make all kinds of assumptions about me. Like mom's like, why are you talking about the fact that we started out McCullough Homes? I was like, because nobody assumes that shit, Mom. And Dave, everybody's like, well, you must be from Southeast DC. No, he's from Silver Spring. It's right there. And I guess many of your family don't go to college. You didn't go to college. He was the only man in the family since slavery not to go to college. He is named for Bishop William David Chappelle, his great-grandfather, who coming out of slavery, went to college, went to seminary, became the Paul of the AME Church, was president of Wilberforce. That's who he's named for. And my godfather, his dad, went to Brown at 15 in 1955. And his mom was the first black woman ordained as a Unitarian priest, minister. Dave's a bad dude. And I would say to him, man, whenever they say you're from Southeast, why don't you just correct them? Right. He's like, man, why would I want to raise the bar? We have been best friends since we were 18 years old. We're getting some of our wild exploits. He saved my life more than once. It's in the book. I taught him how to shoot. That's how the book starts. I don't want to give all the book away. Right, if you want to know why Dave needed me to train him how to shoot, read the book. And I've been his fixer when Hollywood acts badly since we were in our early 20s. But the way I became his fixer is the day that we actually met Chris Rock. We were 18 years old. We were in New York. We were sitting at a table at a place called this isn't in the book, at a place called the Coffee Shop. Maxwell was literally the bartender then. Ladies, you missed your chance. We were counting 1s, 5s, 10s, and 20s on a tabletop during the crack epidemic, kind of hoping the cops would come and ask us what was going on. Because Dave had just told jokes in Washington Square Park for 15 minutes and made $750. So I called, the way I became Dave's fixer is first thing I fixed was his dad. I called my godfather. I said, look, I know you're really freaked out because Dave will be the first man in the family not to go to college in slavery. But I just saw your son make $750 in a park in 15 minutes doing something that's highly illegal. I didn't know that was possible. It's going to be okay.
But the reason that that's important also is that has helped ground you also in a way where when you also have these other, types of experiences through your family, it gives you that reality check, gives you that reality moment to understand the human condition. That's what
Oh, 100%.
The
I
human
mean,
condition.
in the middle of this book is a telling of what President McKinley's assassination teaches us about the failures of racial profiling. But the lead into that is Chappelle, before anyone else, figuring out a key piece of solving who the DC snipers were on stage. He's blessed to be able to make his money, telling jokes at night a few nights a week. So he spends most of the week with that brain of his dad and his mom and his great granddad reading the newspapers and thinking about the human condition. When I'm really lost, when I was reading the NAACP or whatever, I would call Dave and he would just break it down in 15 seconds. I'd be like, cool, I'll hang up the phone. But you'll appreciate it. You remember when the NAACP buried the N-word?
Mm-hmm.
So we're in Cincinnati. Dave lives down the street in Yellow Springs, Ohio. I'm getting ready to be rolled out as president of the NAACP. I'm walking up on stage. Dave grabs me. This isn't the book. And he leans in my ear and he goes, Ben, should you decide to bury anything as president of the NAACP, I would respectfully ask that you make sure it's dead. Because I saw that N-word crossing the street. Man, he scared me to death.
But getting back to the DC snipers, and this is also, once again, something important in this, is if you remember, the first description was that they were white in a white van. And that's who the authorities were looking for. And it reinforced a stereotype that Ben talks about where Dave goes, no, they're black. These snipers are black.
And find out why. It's pure Dave Chappelle genius, but it happened to be true.
all of this, Ben, when you look at, the fact that conversations that you had with Jack Kemp, Congressman Jack Kemp, who in many ways, has been a friend as a Republican to many African-American. I can tell you firsthand, when I was teaching a youth entrepreneurship course with an organization out of New Jersey, it was Secretary of HUD Jack Kemp that used HUD monies to put something in place called reverse commute, which allowed people living in the project to go to jobs in the suburbs. And that was part of the funding that helped us teach a youth entrepreneurship course. My point is, people like that have also had an impact on you in conversations with people like Congressman Jack Kemp.
No, 100%. Kemp was a relationship forged for me by Julian Bond, who had made him co-chair on the Commission on the Future of the NAACP. And I said, why do we have a Republican doing this? And he said, because we don't protect civil rights without them. It's going to take more than Democrats, and with this, we wouldn't have a job. And but Colin Powell really drove it home for me. He said, Ben, it's easy to figure out what you can disagree with somebody about. What's far more important in a democracy is find the one thing you can agree on and go get that done. And so the unlikely heroes of the book are at least 4 Republican governors who step up, in many instances when their Democratic predecessors wouldn't, to do the work of the NAACP, fighting mass incarceration and related issues. But the optimism to walk in, it came from Amy Todd, came from knowing men like Jack Kemp, came from knowing men like Colin Powell. I'm an organizer. Number one role of organizing is ask, because if you don't ask, you get nothing. And when you're black, this isn't a theory. It may not be you, it may just be your family members, but somebody you love is being held back by whatever you're fighting for. And you got to fix it, or you got to face them and feel insufficient. And so you will ask anybody you think might be helpful. And as a guy who ran for governor as a Democrat, it was weird to go back to the manuscript and be like, man, I only praise Republican governors. But that tells a lot about the state of politics. We've got too many damn cowards in office.
Well, Ben, before we get to the questions and read some of the questions, I do want you to touch on what I think is a very important point. You now have a relationship with the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
But how important is education? Because one of the themes I see throughout the book is, yes, we must be rooted in grassroots and all that stuff, but we've got to be educated. We've got to understand the intricacies of things to break them down. How important was it as a Rhodes Scholar, as somebody, to also accentuate education and excellence as you're doing these pursuits?
Well, the most important thing to me in many ways were the teachers. I mean, my family was going to make sure that I read no matter what. My grandmother would call the roll across the family in different lines for who was the person who was so courageous as to learn how to read during slavery. Like we knew those names. But I would not have become a Rhodes Scholar really but for two men, maybe three. I mean, Kurt Schmoke inspired all of us. But let's be honest, person that like made Kurt Schmoke feel like this must be possible was Paul Sarbanes. Because in Baltimore, when a Greek guy can break through into the club of the WASPs, and with all the momentum we had,
At Harvard.
Yeah.
Senator Paul Sarbanes.
All of a sudden, black folks, well, maybe we can break through too. The wall came down for the Greeks. And no, Paul was a good man. But I had a teacher who saw something in me. I try to do this when I get pen. You're always a magnet for black students when you're a black professor in the ivory tower. And he said to me, first semester, my freshman year, Jealous, you would make a great Rhodes Scholar. I was like, have you seen my GPA? He was like, yeah, I gave you one of them Bs. You're going to have to change that. He's like, if nobody's told you in the Ivy League, a B is like a D and a C is an F. So you got to it's not that hard to get the A's. But just knowing that brother that had done it, knowing his name, changed my whole life. And what I say to young black folks is, and it's true for women too, you have to know what your gold star is going to be and go after it. You got to have something when you walk into the room, nobody doubts you. And that was a trip. Coming back from Oxford, where my first day, it's in the book, I met one of the most virulent racists I had ever met in college, just on the street. And he couldn't try to diminish me anymore. I had won the one thing that he wanted that he could never get. Because I was apparently better than he was. And I saw it on his face. I didn't say it, his face said it. The most beautiful day of my life to that point was watching that racist just have to eat every assumption he had ever made about me and doubt himself.
Let's get a couple of questions in here, Ben. These have been submitted and written on these index cards. I want to thank the Public Library, Cleve and Sophia. Thank you very much for all of this. Yes, please. In our Pratt Library system.
Thank you.
And before I get to the questions, right across the Edgar Allan Poe room is a place in this library that 41 years ago, a 20-year-old Clarence Mitchell IV was president of the Young Democrats of Baltimore City. And monthly meetings were held in the Edgar Allan Poe room here with a young Lisa Mitchell. She wasn't married then. Lisa Mitchell. I made sure I get her membership so I get a vote. And we had these meetings here, but the Wheeler Auditorium, I was telling Ben, has been a regular place for events like this long before under Dr. Carla Hayden, who's now the Library of Congress. So I just want to begin by saying thank you to the library for putting this together in a long history. Here's the question, Mr. Ben Jealous. What's your opinion of the future of African-American youth related to today's atmosphere in the United States?
The number one thing we need to do for all our kids, and if it's urgent, you feel it in places like Baltimore when it comes to black kids, is to connect the education we give them to the economic opportunities that will exist when they come out. It is broken. We tell all these young boys, you ain't nothing unless you go to college. And then every building trade, where honestly, a lot of them can make a lot more money than they will make after they get out of college with zero debt.
Tell my plumber that just came to my house.
Right? Like the average age is like 65 and climbing because they can't find enough young people to become tradesmen. We tell all of them, like the future's in computers, when things, when those jobs, frankly, are being turned over to AI. But you can't turn over a nurse to AI. So we have to be much more systematic, I would say, with our young people about seeing each one of them as an investment in the future, the same way our families did during slavery. When my grandmother's, grandmothers, great-grandmothers were inciting. This title, what we figured out, is a battle cry. I don't want to tell all of it, but it's a battle cry handed down from on our maternal bloodline from the first woman to come over, to be enslaved and dragged to America. This was what she said to her children. Now, who she is fascinating. I don't want to give it away. But, you know, she was saying that, you know, and down the line, and that's what gave my grandmother the steel in her spine, which is why she would never back off of it, even though it wasn't logical, even though we had forgotten where we came from. I figured out where we came from. I figured out who likely said it and why. And so, you know, we got to see our children. We got to raise our children to be freedom fighters. And we have to help them understand that that starts with having a clear vision for their own success. And that means we have to do the research with them to guide them and understand who they are and how they learn and what they're best on the path for, and then give them choices for how they can make real money and understand that even if they go a different way, they will at least understand what a plan looks like.
This next question, and while we have to do, of course, the social activism that you've been a part of your whole life, we have to understand it's on a political umbrella that we operate. Vangelis, who do you think will be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024 is one of the questions.
At this point, I would say it's most likely going to be Joe Biden. And I'll support him because incumbency, as I learned, is a very powerful thing. With that said, we have an incredible bench in the Democratic Party of young people who did not look conventional, who are different. I've been on a journey with Stacey Abrams, the origin of which is in the book, since I was 19 years old. I can't tell you how many people counted her out, not just because she's Black, not just because she's a woman, but literally because they may not like the shape of her body or the shade of her skin or the texture of her hair. I'm not going to cuss again on the stage, but that's the only appropriate response. Stacey Abrams is force of nature. She always has been. If you want to understand what it's like to stand next to somebody with the personal power of a Frederick Douglass, go out and hang out with Stacey for a day. And there's a lot of young folks like that. B. Wen down in Georgia is like that. We got folks here in Maryland like that. And what I would say is we've got to do a better job of what the Mitchell machine used to do, which is spotting that talent and clearing the path and pushing them up and not accepting that somebody needs to be in line for 40 years before they get to be president. That's why the Republicans clean our clock all the time. They have no problem putting like damn near 30-year-olds on the Supreme Court. I cussed again.
That's all right. But to make you emphasize your point, there would be no United States Senator John Ossoff or somebody who passed it right here in Baltimore, was in my legislative district, Raphael Warnock over at Douglas Memorial Church before he went down to Georgia. They would not be United States senators without Stacey Abrams.
No, I mean 1,000%. But and here's the thing, right? Somebody said to me once, "Oh, you know, there were, you know, before Stacey, you know, lost this last race. I do hope she runs again." But they said, "Yo, you think Stacey Abrams is like the second coming of Barack Obama?" I said, "No." You know why? Because Barack Obama didn't say 10 years before he ran for president, say, "I'm going to transform the American electorate and then I'll run for president. And I'm going to do the hard work." Stacey learned from the movement leaders, like the ones who raised you and the ones who raised me, that there is an electorate to be transformed if you do the hard work, and then you can open doors with it. And she did the work for a decade before she ran the first time. And then she lost and she kept doing it. And she's going to keep on doing it. And, you know, I'm about to go be the head of the Sierra Club. What I can tell you is if you want to know when America will be serious about ending climate change or civil rights or women's rights, it's when we flip Georgia blue and it stays that way. And then we flip South Carolina, which numerically is easier. And then we go over to Alabama, which is already blinking purple, and do the same thing and just close the door on the foolishness in the U.S. Senate that historically has come out of places like that.
Look at Arizona.
But yeah, but you know, Raphael Warnock disappointed me this last time because he should have been more outspoken for Stacey than he was this time. I've known Raphael for a long time. But Raphael was chairman of her nonprofit. She's the one who chose him to run for Senate. And, you know, if you want to know what it's like to actually build a political machine in a tough place that yields transformative results quickly, that's what Stacey's done in Georgia.
I'm glad for that background. I need to call Senator Warnock, let him know. Don't forget, you started here at Douglas Memorial now.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I'm just saying, he was in my district. We go back.
Yes, he's a good man.
Anyway, yeah.
He's a good man.
This question, I think, is an important one because it speaks to what you have talked about in the book, Ben, and just the ability to work with those that even you might disagree with or might disagree with you at times. The question says, thanks, Ben Jealous, for coming out. Why did you invite C4 from a right Fox-like station, WBAL, to participate in this event at the library?
Okay, stop writing questions, Clarence. But no, I'm on Fox News tonight at 8 o'clock. I'll be on Newsmax on Monday at 6:50 a.m. I did the conservative thought hour for 45 minutes. This is the work that Dr. King urged us to do in his letter from a Birmingham jail, where he talked about how much time he spent talking to his jailer, trying to convince that white man who wasn't making much money to join the movement because they would both be better off if they teamed up. You don't get to pull people together without talking to people that aren't standing next to you. And what you find, going back to General Powell's advice, is if you can find one thing you can agree on, and you usually can, you quickly find two, you quickly find three. You might not find more than five, but that's a lot to get done in a lifetime. Governor Bob McDonnell in Virginia, I put this, I had gone to Tim Kaine, who was a Democrat, who was stepping down as governor, it was the end of his term, he's taken over the DNC and said, please, we need to massively accelerate the reenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated people in your state. He just said no. He had run for office with the full faith of Black people, in part because he said he was a civil rights lawyer. Mm-hmm. When the NAACP called and asked him to do his job, he said no. And then I went to a Republican governor. Why? Because there was nobody else to ask. There's only one governor in the state, and we needed to get those people reenfranchised. And I said, look, I asked your predecessor, and I know he had a lot more political skin in the game than you, but would you? And he said, of course. I believe there is a right to redemption. I believe that somebody should not be judged by the worst thing they do on the worst day of their life, and that they can actually, and he's an evangelical, so they would say, with the help of the Lord, their Savior, turn their life around. St. James Episcopal Church over in Holland Park, we're a lot quieter about the use of the word Jesus than Southern Baptists and evangelicals are, but we believe the same thing. So, and one of the members of the outreach ministry was here earlier. I think Father Meadows might have passed through the audience as well. And so we figured out, we both believe that these people should be reenfranchised. We also figured out that we believe that Jesus is on the side of the least of these. And he and I figured out a few other things we can agree on. So, there's still hope for you too, Clarence.
I hope so. Pray for me. But Benjamin Todd Jealous, we're going to have a book site. There's going to be signings. Everybody stick around concludes this part of the session. But I want to kind of conclude this part of this with you talking about never forget our people were always free. What do you really want people to take away from this? What do you want people to really take away? Who Benjamin Todd Jealous, the grandson of Mamie, who you are and what this is?
My grandmother was a woman who was as on fire, maybe a little more, to end poverty than she was to end racism. Like she gave her all, whatever the Mitchells and Ms. Jackson, anybody wanted, NAACP, whatever they asked, she was a soldier, but she was a leader in the war on poverty in Maryland. And she stayed up at night trying to figure out how to end poverty. And what I figured out was that, that was her grandfather's passion too. It's Dr. King's passion when he was assassinated. What I want people to take away with the book, if you will, if nothing else, was the point that Dr. King was trying to teach us. That the prize in ending racism is that we can all come together, and in coming together, we can all live better lives. That's what he meant when he said that our destinies were combined in a single garment. That's what he meant when he said that you can't be all that you can be until I can be all that I can be, and I can't be all that I can be until you can be all that you can be. That was what he was saying, was that if we can come together, we can make this place great for all our children. And that was the original state of the struggle in America in the very beginning, when European indentured servants and African slaves kept coming together. And in researching this book, brother, I found out that former Confederate soldiers and former freedmen did it too. There is a magnetism between people who are suffering from the same ills. That magnetism is the pull of their shared dreams for each other's children. Let us get back to the picking up the baton from Dr. King, and let us not pretend it's anything easy or anything that sounds like a fairy tale. This is the hard work of making the American dream real. We can do it. We can do it before the century is over, and it's literally as easy and as hard as undoing something our country created a long time ago.
God bless you, brother. God bless you. Once again, we're going to have signings. Oh, no, there he is. There he is. Cleve is right here to take over at this point. So once again, I just want to thank everybody here at Enoch Pratt for everything they've done to put this together. Thank you. Cleve.
Thank you,
There you
C4, and thank Ben Jealous. One more round of applause, please. And we will have a book signing right now. My colleague Sophia will be the front of the line. She'll form the line left. Urban Reads bookstores outside. Please buy a book. We'll be back out in about 3 minutes to sign your book. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.